The first thing Callum Voss ever said to me was, "You're going to want to hold still," and I have been trying, ever since, to do the opposite. I'll tell you what the mountain looked like that day, because it matters. It was the kind of October morning that comes to the Front Range maybe 3 times a year. The light low and lateral off the Rockies, the tree line crisp against a sky that had no business being that blue, the air so clear it felt like an argument against everything complicated. I was working a trauma at Denver Health when the call came in. Hiker down, possible compound fracture, elevation 11,400 feet, half a mile above the Grays Peak trailhead. SAR was already on scene. They needed a physician on the ground. I went. That was not unusual. Dr. Rowan Teller, emergency medicine, 33 years old, 3 years running mountain rescue support out of Jefferson County. I'd done 40-something field calls. I knew how to move in altitude. I knew how to work without a supply cart, without a crash team, without the infrastructure that makes hospital medicine feel like it has a floor under it. Field medicine is different. Field medicine is just you and what you brought and whatever the mountain decides to do next. The hiker, a man named Gerald, 58, Albuquerque, his first 14er attempt, had gone off trail in the dark and had found out the hard way what scree does to an ankle at speed. He was alert and oriented and furious with himself and in significant pain, and he was alive, which was the only column that mattered. The SAR tech crouched beside him when I arrived was the one who said, "You're going to want to hold still, not to me, to Gerald." And Gerald held still, because the voice that said it was the kind of voice that doesn't suggest. It informs, low and even, the particular frequency of someone who has said this exact thing in this exact situation enough times that it has become pure signal, no noise. The SAR tech looked up when I crouched across from him. He had about 3 days of beard, a helmet with a small crack in the left side that had been there long enough to be weathered, and eyes that were the precise gray-green of the sky over the divide 20 minutes before a storm. "You the doc," he said. "Rowan Teller." He nodded. "Callum Voss, left tibial fracture, displaced, possible fibula involvement. He hit this rock," he indicated a flat slab to Gerald's right, "with the lateral ankle first, then rotated. I've got the leg stabilized, but I need you to tell me if we're looking at vascular compromise before we move him." It was a good assessment. It was a precise assessment. I checked Gerald's foot, capillary refill, dorsal pulse, sensation, and told Callum what I found, and he absorbed it without comment, without the performative deference that some field techs do around physicians and that I have always found exhausting. He just took the information and began adjusting his plan. We worked Gerald for 40 minutes, at elevation, in October, in wind that was making up its mind about something. Callum moved with the efficiency of someone who has learned that wasted motion at altitude costs oxygen and oxygen is currency, and he communicated in short, accurate sentences that required no translation. And he never once did the thing where field personnel go rigid and deferential because a doctor showed up. He just kept doing his job and treated me like I was doing mine, which I was. Gerald made it down. He went to Denver Health's orthopedic floor. He sent a card 3 months later that I have, for reasons I cannot entirely explain, kept. But that's not the part I want to tell you. Here's the part that actually started everything, and you almost missed it. What happened after Gerald was on the litter and the extraction team was moving was this. Callum Voss sat down on a rock, took off his helmet, and looked at the mountain. Not the way you look at a mountain when you're done with it. The way you look at it when you're still in it. Like it was a conversation that wasn't finished. I sat on a rock 4 feet away because my legs had been going since 5 a.m. and the altitude was real, and I wasn't going to pretend it wasn't. "You do a lot of these?" I said. "About 60 a season." He was still looking at the mountain. "You?" 40-something total, 3 years. He looked at me then. First real look, not the assessment look from over Gerald's leg, but something slower. "You came up fast. Most docs take longer to get comfortable above tree line." "I grew up in Bend," I said. "Oregon. Cascade foothills." "Near enough." He nodded, like that explained something. I didn't ask what. We sat on the rocks above treeline in the October light with the wind coming down off the divide and the extraction team making their careful way down the switchbacks below us, and I thought, this man is the most comfortable person I have ever seen on a mountain. Not in a showy way, in the way that certain people are comfortable in certain places because they have paid for the right with enough hours and cold mornings and close calls to own it. You have another call today? I asked. Probably, he said. October's busy. Yeah. He looked at me again, sideways. You need to descend before me. I'm good, I said. Okay, he said. We sat there for another 11 minutes. I know because I was watching the time, for reasons I told myself were clinical. The divide threw a long shadow across the basin below. A pair of Clark's nutcrackers worked the white bark pines at the far edge of the tree line. Callum watched them for a while with the same attention he'd given the mountain, which was the same attention he'd given Gerald's ankle. Total, unhurried, without any evident need for the moment to be something other than what it was. I had been in exactly one relationship in the previous 3 years. It had ended because I worked too much and was, according to my ex, constitutionally incapable of being present in low-stakes situations. I had spent approximately 0 hours thinking about whether this was true. On that rock at 11,400 feet, I thought about it for the first time. Wait, don't skip ahead, because this next part changes everything you think you know about how this goes. He called the Jefferson County SAR dispatch to check in. I heard his voice on the radio, different from field voice, same frequency, equally unhurried. Gave the extraction status, confirmed his position, said he'd be down in 40. When he clicked off, he looked at the sky to the west. Storm systems moving up from Taos, he said. Might get here by Thursday. You check weather like that, just by looking? I check weather on my phone like everyone else. But yeah, a pause. You learn to read it after a while. What does this guy say? He looked at it for a moment. That it hasn't decided yet. He glanced at me. That's usually the most honest answer. I did not have a good response to that. I filed it somewhere. We descended together. Callum moved downhill the way he'd worked the field site, efficient, quiet, adaptive, reading the terrain 2 steps ahead. I kept up. He noticed that I kept up and didn't comment on it, which was the right response. Somewhere around the tree line, he found a section of icy crust on the switchback and stopped, tested it with his boot, found a better line 20 feet to the right, without consulting a trail marker or asking my opinion. Good call, I said. Seen 2 ACLs on that patch in the last month, he said. Different days. Same ice. Same ice. Trail crew knows. It's on the list. He looked back at it as we passed. It's always on someone's list. At the trailhead, we stopped at our separate vehicles. Mine was a 10-year-old Subaru with a Denver Health parking permit and a cervical collar under the front seat. His was a gray pickup with a SAR insignia on the door and gear I could see through the window, organized with the precision of someone who has learned that a misplaced carabiner at altitude is not an inconvenience, it's an argument. Good work up there, I said. You too, he said. Your vascular assessment was fast. 3 years in the ED before this. Which ED? University of Colorado, then Denver Health. He nodded. He had his keys in his hand. He looked at them briefly, and then at me. There's a SAR debrief at the Jeffco station Thursday, he said. We do them after every technical extraction. You're not required to come, but if you want to see how the call gets reviewed from the rescue side. What time? I said 6 p.m. I'll be there, I said. He got in the truck. I got in the Subaru. I drove back to Denver with the windows down and the heat on and the Rockies in the rear view, and thought about almost nothing at all, which, for me, was extraordinary. Here's what I didn't understand yet, and this is the part that took me the longest. The Jefferson County SAR station smelled like waterproof gear and old coffee and the particular industrial clean of a place where equipment is maintained with religious seriousness. There were 8 people at the debrief. Callum ran it, not as the most senior person. There were 2 team leads with more years. He ran it because he was the one who had been on scene, and because the way he described what had happened was precise and structural and completely without editorializing. He talked about the approach, the assessment, the stabilization, the extraction line. He talked about the ice on the switchback, same ice he'd mentioned to me, same flat effect, and recommended an outreach to trail crew. He talked about what had worked and what could have been faster, and did not use the word "I" once in the structural portion of the debrief. When it was over, he mentioned to the group that I had provided field medical support and that the vascular assessment had been the deciding factor in confirming safe extraction protocol. He did this in 2 sentences, the same way he did everything. Informational, no decoration. After, he handed me a cup of coffee that I had not asked for. "I wasn't sure how you take it," he said. "Black is fine." "Good." He sat across from me at the long table. "You have questions about the debrief?" "About 6, I said. "Ask them." I asked them. He answered all 6 without hedging and without checking whether I was impressed by the answers. And when I pushed back on one point, his call to delay extraction by 8 minutes for a secondary splint, he explained his reasoning without defensiveness and then said, "If you'd been faster on scene by 3 minutes, that's a different calculus." Worth noting for future calls. "You're not wrong," I said. "Neither are you," he said. "Different information set." We stayed at the table after everyone else had left. The coffee got cold. Outside the station windows, the foothills went dark in stages, the way they do in October, when the light pulls back from the mountains first, and then from the plains, and then from everything. "You do this every season?" I asked. 8 years, he said. "Why?" He looked at his coffee cup. "Not a pause for performance. A real pause, the kind of pause someone takes when they're going to tell you something true instead of something easy. I'm better out there than in here," he said. I understood this completely. It was the most personal thing he'd said, and he'd said it like a fact. "Me too," I said. He looked at me. First time he'd held eye contact for more than the functional duration. "You staying in Denver?" he said. "Long term? Don't know." I looked out the window. "I keep thinking I'll figure that out." "Most people who stay figure it out by October," he said. "Something about the first snow." "Has it snowed yet?" "Not yet." He turned his coffee cup once on the table. "Thursday said maybe." "The storm from Taos?" "It moved faster than I thought," he said, and then, almost to himself, "It usually does." But the part nobody talks about with mountain people, don't miss this. Callum Voss did not do small talk. This was not unfriendliness. It was the same economy that characterized everything else about him, a preference for signal over noise, for what was real over what was social. He would go 40 minutes without speaking, and it would not feel like withdrawal. It would feel like someone who was actually present and didn't need to fill the presence with sound. This over the weeks that followed, because we kept running into each other. 3 more field calls before November, 2 at the Jeffco station for post-incident reviews, once in the parking lot of a REI in Lakewood, where we both stood in the technical gear aisle for 2 minutes before either of us acknowledged the coincidence. "Crampons," he said, holding up a pair. "Gloves," I said. "Good choice," he said. "Yours are too thin for December up there." "I know. I put them in my basket. I've been meaning to replace them." "You're going to be on a technical call in January in inadequate gloves," he said. This was not a criticism. It was a diagnosis. "Probably," I said. He put a second pair of crampons in his basket without explanation. We checked out in different lines. In the parking lot, he handed me the crampons. "I had a spare set I didn't need," he said. "You bought them just now." "I had a spare set I didn't need," he said again. I took the crampons. That was the moment. Not dramatic, not cinematic. Just a man who had decided to do something and did it and didn't make it a production. And another man, me, who understood that this was the language and that he had been speaking it for weeks and that he had been listening. This is where I need you to stay with me, because here's what the mountain actually does to 2 people. November came. The storm from Taos arrived late, but it arrived serious. 18 inches at elevation, 6 in Denver proper, the kind of storm that turns the Front Range from postcard to real in about 4 hours. Denver Health went to surge protocols. Jefferson County SAR went to standby. I worked a 22-hour shift. When I came out of the hospital at 6 in the morning, the city was white and quiet, in the specific way that cities are quiet after heavy snow. Not silent, but muffled, like the world had put something soft between itself and all the noise it usually makes. Callum had texted at 3 a.m. Storm closed the passes. We had a missing hiker call that stood down at midnight. You working? I texted back at 6. 07 standing in the hospital parking lot. Just finished. 22 hours? And here's the part that broke me open. Pay attention. The place on Colfax was a counter-service diner with 9 stools and a chalkboard menu and coffee that came in ceramic mugs the size of your hand. It was run by a woman named Berta, who clearly knew Callum because she had his coffee waiting before he sat down. He introduced me as Rowan. He's a doctor. He just did a 22-hour. Berta put a second mug down and said, "Good Lord," with feeling, and went back to the kitchen. We sat at the counter. Outside the windows, Colfax was still mostly snow. A city bus went by slowly, leaving tracks. The diner smelled like biscuit dough and coffee, and the particular warmth of a small room where the heat has been on all night. Callum said nothing for about 3 minutes. I said nothing for about 3 minutes. It was not awkward. It was 2 people who were both very tired, sitting in the warmth, and letting the warmth be enough for a minute. Then he said, "What was the worst call last night?" And I told him. Not the sanitized version, the real one, with the specific details that I don't tell people who aren't in medicine, because the details are the part that stays with you, and you need somewhere to put them. He listened with his hands around his mug and his eyes on the counter, and he did not flinch, and he did not perform sympathy, and he did not say, "I'm so sorry," in the way that makes it about the person saying it. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment. "That's a hard one," he said. "Yeah." "Did you make the right calls?" "Yes." "Then you carry it right," he said. "That's all." I looked at him. "I mean, you don't put it down," he said. "You just carry it in a way that doesn't wreck your posture." I thought about this for a long time. I am still thinking about it. "You okay?" he said, and I almost said, "I'm fine," which is what I say to everyone, always, reflexively, as muscle memory. I almost said it, and then I looked at this man in this diner at 6 in the morning after a 22-hour shift and thought, he will know if you're lying. Not because he'll call you out, because he pays attention, and he deserves the real answer, and you know it. "I keep being," I said. He looked at me for a moment. Something shifted in his face. Not a smile, something underneath a smile, something that comes before. "Me too," he said. Outside, the snow on Colfax was starting to thin. A plow went by. The city was beginning, incrementally, to remember it was a city. Berta put biscuits down in front of us without asking and went away again. We ate. We didn't talk for a while. Then we talked for 2 hours. His response came in 40 seconds. "There's a place on Colfax that opens at 6. Coffee and biscuits, if you're not already driving." I stood in the parking lot for a moment. I was exhausted in the particular way of 22-hour shifts. Not sleepy, past sleepy, into a kind of transparent lucidity where everything feels slightly more real than it usually does, and your own defenses are just too tired to show up. I texted, "Send the address." Here's the part I almost kept to myself. January, a technical rescue on the north face of Mount Bierstadt. Callum's team, my support. The patient was out by noon. We were back at the vehicles by 2. The mountain had done what the mountain does in January, given us everything it had and required us to give back the same, and we were both in that specific post-call state that field work produces. Quiet, grounded, a little outside of ordinary time. He was stowing gear in the truck bed. I was doing the same in the Subaru. The afternoon light was the winter Front Range light, low and crystalline and honest, with no softness in it at all, everything sharp-edged and exact. I walked to the truck. "Callum." He turned around. He looked at me with the full attention that was, I had learned, just his default. No partition, no managed distance, just present. I've been trying to figure out how to say this, I said, and I don't have a clean version, so I'm just going to say the real one. Okay, he said. I want more of this, I said. Not just the calls, not just the debriefs. I want more of whatever this has been for the last 3 months. I want to figure out what it is when it's not on a mountain. Callum was quiet, not the absence of response quiet, the active kind, the kind where someone is actually processing what you said and not just waiting for their turn. I don't do things halfway, he said. I want you to know that. If we start this, I'm going to be, he paused, consistent. I'm going to show up. That's how I'm built. If that's what you want, I want it too. But I needed you to know what you're getting. I looked at him. Callum, I said. Consistent is the thing I've been missing for 3 years. He was quiet for another moment. Then he reached out and put his hand on the side of my face. One hand, thumb below my cheekbone, unhurried, and looked at me the way he'd looked at the mountain that first day above Gray's Peak. Like a conversation he wasn't finished with. You okay? He said. I keep being, I said. Me too, he said. The mountain was behind us and the plains were ahead, and the winter light made the whole world sharp and specific and real, and he left his hand there for a long moment, and I leaned into it, and neither of us felt the cold. What a trail camera mounted on a white bark pine at 11,400 feet recorded on a Saturday in March. 2 figures on the ridge above the Gray's Peak treeline, one in Jefferson County SAR orange, one in a dark shell with a Denver Health ID clipped to the chest strap. The SAR tech had stopped at the top of a fixed line section and was looking at the divide. The doctor had stopped beside him. They were standing close, not touching, looking at the same thing. The camera recorded 4 minutes of stillness. Wind moved through the frame. 2 Clark's nutcrackers worked the white bark pines below. The divide held its shadow across the basin. Then the doctor said something. The SAR tech turned. He put his hand on the back of the doctor's neck. One hand, brief, careful. The doctor tilted his head back slightly. The camera recorded this for 11 seconds. Then they started moving again, up the ridge, into the open above tree line, where the world was wide and clean and asked nothing of them except to be present in it. The camera ran until its battery died at dusk. By then the ridge was empty. The mountain, as always, kept what it knew.